So, um, imagine you walk into a party,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
and the person hosting it is, like, sweating profusely.
Yeah.
They're just pacing the room, constantly checking the thermostat, asking if the music is too loud.
Oh, yeah, the nervous host.
Yeah, like nervously refilling the chip bowl every 2 minutes. And they're desperately trying to read your facial expressions to see if you're actually having a good time.
Right, because they need you to have a good time.
Yes. Their entire sense of self-worth for the evening depends entirely on your validation. Like, if you leave early, they're going to be absolutely crushed.
That sounds exhausting, honestly.
It is, right. But now, contrast that with a second, entirely different kind of party. You walk through the doors, and the host is already bursting with laughter.
Totally different vibe.
Completely. The room is just overflowing with self-sufficient joy. They threw this massive celebration out of the sheer abundance of their own happiness.
So they're already having a blast regardless.
Yeah, they're already having a fantastic time. And when you arrive, you're simply invited to step into a joy that, already exists.
A joy that doesn't depend on your reaction to validate it.
Spot on. And that sharp contrast, that sets the stage for everything we're looking at today. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a collection of essays examining Matthew 17, verses 1 through 8.
Which is the Transfiguration narrative.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the historical context, the literary structure, and the massive theological claims made by our sources regarding this event.
There is a lot to unpack there.
There really is. We're going to look at what happened on that mountain, why it happened when it did, and what it reveals about the very nature of the Creator.
Which brings us right back to your party analogy.
It does, because the text we're analyzing makes a very specific argument. It claims that God is not the nervous, sweating host. God is the one overflowing with uncontainable joy.
Yeah, that analogy is super useful for framing the author's primary argument, because the source material, it launches a pretty aggressive critique against what it identifies as a tragic flaw in modern church culture.
Right, specifically modern evangelicalism.
Exactly. The author argues that contemporary seeker-sensitive models of church practice have, they've propagated a shrunken, man-centered view of the Almighty.
The text uses a really arresting phrase for that, doesn't it?
It does. It says these models paint God as a cosmic beggar.
A cosmic beggar, wow.
Yeah, the idea being pushed in many modern circles is that God is portrayed as lonely or empty and pacing the corridors of heaven.
Hoping that rebellious sinners might look up and choose to salvage his broken self-esteem by loving him back.
Right. And the source text asserts that this caricature is entirely foreign to the biblical witness. It stands as an absolute assault on the self-sufficiency of God.
If you're listening to this, think about how often you've heard phrases like, God has a hole in his heart that only you can fill.
Oh, I've heard that one countless times.
Or the idea that God created humanity because he was lonely and needed companionship.
Yeah, which sounds nice, but the text is arguing that completely flips the biblical script.
It really does. It places human beings at the center of the universe and turns God into someone who is dependent on our response.
Precisely. And drawing on historic Protestant theology, the author points out the classic Christian position that God is alone in and unto himself all-sufficient.
There's a technical term for that, right?
Yeah, the theological term is aseity, A-S-E-I-T-Y, meaning God exists entirely from himself.
So he doesn't need anything outside of himself.
Right. He doesn't stand in need of any creatures he has made, nor does he derive any necessary completion from them. He's the independent source of all life, all matter, and all joy.
Because if God needed us to be happy, then God would be dependent on us.
And a dependent God is not sovereign.
Man, that's a huge point. And the text actually brings up a fascinating translation issue to back this up. It looks specifically at a verse from the Apostle Paul.
Ah, yes, 1 Timothy 1:11.
Right. It notes that the traditional translation in English usually reads something like, the glorious gospel of the blessed God.
Which sounds very standard, very traditional.
It does.
Yeah.
But the source leans on the classic Greek commentary by the 19th century scholar Henry Alford. And it argues that this traditional translation actually robs the text of its true weight.
How so?
Well, the literal Greek phrase is the gospel of the glory of the happy God. The word there is makarios, which means happy, fortunate, or blissful.
That is a massive shift in perspective.
Isn't it? Going from a God who is just blessed in a religious, formal sense to a God who is fundamentally, eternally happy.
It's a huge shift, and the logic the author uses to build on that translation is, quite frankly, airtight.
Yeah, they pull heavily from John Piper's work here, right?
They do. The source argues that a major constituent of God's glory is his absolute self-replenishing happiness.
I mean, think about the alternative for a minute.
Right, if God were miserable or frustrated or constantly wringing his
Or
hands,
just unfulfilled in general.
then the gospel wouldn't be glad tidings. No one would want to spend eternity with a depressed deity.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't. And furthermore, if God's happiness were anchored in something outside of himself, like, say, human obedience or human affection,
Then his joy would be incredibly fragile.
yeah, it would be contingent and changeable based on human behavior, which, let's be honest, is notoriously unreliable.
Extremely unreliable. But the text insists that the ultimate joy for the Christian is entering into the Master's pre-existing, overflowing joy.
And the source references Jonathan Edwards here to explain how that works within the Trinity.
Yes, the American Puritan. Edwards explains that the Father's infinite pleasure is found in his own co-equal Son.
The Son being the perfect personal reproduction of the Father's essence.
Exactly. So the pleasure of God in his Son is the pleasure of God in himself. It is an unbroken, infinite loop of joy within the Trinity.
Okay, I hear what the author is saying, but a question naturally arises here, and I think it's one you listening at home might be asking right now.
Go for it.
If God is completely self-contained, infinitely happy within this Trinitarian fellowship, and needs absolutely nothing from humanity to complete him, why did he bother creating people at all?
It's the logical next question.
Right. If he isn't lonely, why make a universe filled with fragile, rebellious creatures? It almost makes it sound like we are entirely superfluous.
Well, the essays we are looking at tackle that question head on, and the argument they make is actually quite beautiful.
What's their answer?
They argue the biblical narrative does not begin with divine emptiness seeking human company. Instead, it begins with divine fullness bubbling over in sovereign grace.
Bubbling over. I like that imagery.
Yeah, creation, therefore, is an expression of his joy, not a remedy for divine loneliness. God created the universe not because he was deficient and needed an audience to clap for him,
Right.
but because his infinite happiness is so expansive, so weighty, that it overflows into the creation of beings who can actually share in it.
So we aren't created to fill a void in God.
No, we are created to be recipients of a joy that has existed since before the foundation of the world. Redemption is not the repair of divine frustration.
It's the triumph of divine gladness, extending mercy to the miserable.
Precisely.
Well, if God is bursting with this overwhelming self-sufficient joy, it makes sense that when he finally decides to pull the curtain back and show it to humanity, he doesn't do it in a crowded, noisy city square.
No, he orchestrates a very specific, physically isolated environment to mirror that singular focus.
So let's look at where Jesus actually takes his closest disciples to reveal this reality. We need to examine the geography and the history of the Mount of Transfiguration.
The physical and historical setting is crucial for interpreting this event accurately, and the source spends significant time detailing it.
Yeah, no, it's a geographic debate, right?
Right. Later ecclesiastical traditions often associated the Transfiguration with Mount Tabor, which is located further south in the region of Galilee.
But the source disagrees with that.
It does. Rigorous biblical geography and chronological calculations in our sources point strongly to Mount Hermon instead.
And Mount Hermon is massive compared to Tabor.
Oh, it is. It rises over 9,000 feet above sea level at the extreme northern border of Israel. It has snow-capped peaks for much of the year.
So it really represents a place of towering, majestic isolation.
Absolutely.
And what makes that location so compelling to me is what was happening right at the base of that mountain.
In Caesarea Philippi.
Yeah, this event happens immediately following Jesus' ministry in Caesarea Philippi, and that region was heavily dominated by pagan shrines.
Very heavily.
Specifically, there was an infamous massive rock face with a grotto dedicated to the Greek god Pan, the god of the wild, shepherds, and flocks.
Who is often associated with panic and fertility cults.
Yeah, the Romans and Greeks built temples right into the cliffside there.
And the socio-political tension of this specific era is running incredibly high in the background, too.
Give us a picture of that tension.
Well, you have the Roman military occupation enforcing their brutal rule over the Jewish people. Locally, you have the puppet dynasty of the Herods administering that Roman rule through political compromise.
So lots of political unrest.
Huge unrest. Then, within the Jewish religious community itself, there is massive fracturing. The text points out the intense legalism of the Pharisees.
Right, a sect that originated from a desire for purity.
Yeah, but they had ended up burying the law of God under massive layers of human traditions and strict behavioral codes.
And on the other side, you had the Sadducees.
Exactly. The aristocratic Sadducees, who controlled the temple in Jerusalem and had largely turned it into a place of political maneuvering and economic extortion.
So if you step back and look at it, you have this incredibly noisy, corrupted environment. You have pagan idolatry screaming from the shrines of Pan,
Right.
Roman swords dictating daily life, religious leaders arguing over endless traditions or exploiting the poor at the temple. And Jesus leaves Peter, James, and John away from all of that,
He walks them away from the pagan valley.
away from the religious corruption in Jerusalem, up this massive 9,000-foot mountain into pure silence and isolation.
And that geographical separation is highly intentional. The author says it directly mirrors Moses ascending Mount Sinai centuries earlier to receive the Old Covenant away from the idolatry of the Israelites in the desert.
Wow, the parallels are striking.
They are, but the historical ramifications of what happens on Mount Hermon extend far beyond the first-century context of Pharisees and Roman soldiers.
Yeah, the source ties the theological meaning of this text directly to a massive conflict in the early 4th century, specifically the Council of Nicaea.
Which took place in 325 AD.
Right. Now, we need to pause and define that, because the Council of Nicaea is one of those terms that gets thrown around in theology classes, but the actual stakes of it are rarely explained.
That's very true.
So for those of us who haven't studied ancient church history recently, give us the breakdown. Who was Arius, and why did his teachings cause such a massive crisis that the Roman emperor had to convene a council?
Okay, so Arius of Alexandria was a highly influential presbyter or elder in the early 4th century, and he began propagating a specific teaching about the nature of Jesus Christ.
What was he teaching?
Arius argued that the Son was a created being. He believed that the Son was the first and greatest of all created things, and that God used the Son to create the rest of the universe, but that the Son was still fundamentally a creature, subordinate in his very essence to the Father.
He had a slogan for this, didn't he?
He did. Arius had a famous, incredibly catchy slogan that his followers would sing. There was when he was not.
Wow. There was when he was not.
Yeah. He tried to use various scriptures, often taken out of their larger context, to deny the co-eternal, uncreated deity of Christ.
So Arius is essentially arguing that Jesus is a lesser, secondary God. He's highly exalted, maybe the best creature ever made, but he is not on the same level as the Creator.
Correct. And that threatened the absolute core of the Christian faith.
Because of the atonement.
Exactly. If the Son is a creature, then he cannot bear the infinite wrath of God against sin, and humanity is not saved.
So the Council of Nicaea was convened to address this heresy.
Right. The council condemned Arius and his teachings, declaring in the Nicene Creed that the Son is begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father.
Now, the author takes this ancient historical debate and brings it right into the modern era.
Yes, the source draws a straight, aggressive line from that ancient Arian heresy to modern religious groups operating today.
It specifically names Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism.
It does, arguing that they are modern resurrections of Arianism because they deny the co-equal, co-eternal deity of Jesus Christ.
And the author asserts that the Transfiguration narrative in Matthew 17 is designed to defend the uncreated deity of the Son against all such claims.
Right. The Father is not adopting a righteous human man on that mountain. He is pulling back the curtain to vindicate the eternal, uncreated deity of his Son.
That is the core theological argument of the essays regarding the nature of Christ.
Yes. The source insists that the divine voice on the mountain is validating a pre-existing eternal reality, not creating a new status for Jesus.
So, he didn't become the Son of God on the mountain.
No, he was revealed as the eternal Son of God.
I love how the physical geography reinforces that theological point. I mean, think about Mount Hermon's towering physical altitude.
It's way above the valley.
Right, it's physically elevating Jesus thousands of feet above those pagan shrines of Pan down in the valley. It beautifully, tangibly mirrors the theological elevation of Christ above all false idols, all human traditions, and all lesser views of who he is.
It's a perfect visual.
But to really grasp why this event happens exactly when it does, we have to look at the literary structure of Matthew's gospel. The author argues this isn't just a random miracle placed arbitrarily in the timeline.
No, it's highly structured. Matthew's gospel is meticulously designed.
Tell us about that design.
Well, many scholars note that Matthew constructs his entire gospel around 5 major discourse blocks. He's intentionally framing Jesus as the new and greater Moses who gave the 5 books of the Torah.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
And chapter 17 sits right at a major narrative pivot. To understand the Transfiguration, you must understand what happened exactly 1 week prior in Matthew 16.
Okay, set the scene for chapter 16.
So in that previous chapter, Jesus is in the region of Caesarea Philippi, and he asks his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is?
And they give some incorrect rumors first.
Right. But then Peter makes his great definitive confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God.
It's a massive high point. Peter finally gets it.
He does.
But the text shows that immediately after Peter makes this glorious confession, Jesus drops an absolute bombshell on them.
He gives a shocking, horrifying prediction.
Yeah, he tells his closest friends that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders and chief priests, be killed, and be raised on the third day.
And we have to put ourselves in the minds of first-century Jewish men to understand how devastating that was.
I can't even imagine.
To them, a crucified Messiah was a complete oxymoron. It was a categorical contradiction.
Because they had been raised on prophecies of a conquering king.
Exactly. A descendant of David who would physically overthrow the Roman oppressors, cleanse the temple, and establish an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem.
So the idea that the Messiah would be tortured and executed by the pagan Romans was unthinkable.
Unthinkable. Peter is so horrified that he actually takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. He says, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you."
And Jesus' response is intense.
Very intense. Jesus responds with a severe, terrifying rebuke, telling Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man."
Wow.
And then Jesus tells the disciples that anyone who wants to follow him must take up their own cross.
Man, that is incredibly heavy. So it's in this exact contest of shattered expectations, profound fear, and massive confusion that Matthew opens chapter 17 with a very specific chronological marker.
Right. The text says after 6 days.
And the source material highlights that after 6 days is not just casual record keeping.
Not at all. It's a deliberate, neon-flashing reference back to the Old Testament, specifically Exodus 24.16.
Which says what?
In Exodus 24, the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, the cloud covered it for 6 days, and on the 7th day, God called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud.
So Matthew is signaling to his Jewish readers that the Transfiguration is the climactic fulfillment of that Sinai revelation.
Yes, the parallels are undeniable. The author argues this narrative sequence is highly deliberate. The Transfiguration answers the disciples' confusion and terror without removing the reality of the coming cross.
Jesus is showing them that he's not going to suffer because he lacks glory,
Right.
or because the Romans are stronger than him.
Exactly. He is going to suffer because divine glory has chosen the path of obedient redemption.
You know, I think about it like getting a massive spoiler for a movie.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right, usually people hate spoilers because it ruins the suspense of the narrative.
Yeah.
But imagine you're watching a movie where the middle act is so horrific, so tragic, and so emotionally devastating that the audience might actually lose their minds, panic, and walk out of the theater before the movie is over.
They need reassurance.
Yeah, in that specific scenario, the audience needs the spoiler. The disciples are about to watch their supposed king get stripped naked, beaten to a pulp, and nailed to a piece of wood.
A horrific scene.
They needed to see the end of the story, the majesty and the raw divine glory on the mountain, so they could survive the tragic middle act of the crucifixion without losing their faith entirely.
They needed the spoiler to know that the suffering servant is actually the King of Glory.
Exactly.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the author's point. The spoiler was given because the psychological and spiritual trauma of the cross would have been unbearable without it.
So when they later see him beaten and bleeding, they are intended to look back to this moment on Herman.
And know that his life is not being taken from him. He is laying it down willingly.
Well, understanding this setup leads us directly into the text itself, analyzing the specific grammatical and visual elements that occurred on the mountain summit.
Yes, the source provides a thorough syntactical breakdown of Matthew 17, verses 1 through 4.
Let's get into the mechanics of what they actually saw. The text says Jesus' face shines like the sun, and his garments become white as light.
And suddenly, Moses and Elijah appear, conversing with him.
So what's the author's take on this?
The text focuses heavily on the Greek concept of metamorphosis, which is where we get the English word metamorphosis.
Oh, wait.
The source emphasizes that this was not a reception of a near external glory, but a pulling back of the veil of his human flesh.
The author draws a sharp contrast here with Moses, right?
Yes. When Moses went up Mount Sinai and spoke with God, his face shone when he came down. But Moses had borrowed light.
Like the moon reflecting the sun.
Precisely. His face shone because he had been in the presence of glory. But the text says Jesus shone like the sun.
So is demonstrating intrinsic, uncreated divine light emanating from within himself.
Yes, the human nature was temporarily peeling back to reveal the divine nature that had always been there.
And then we have the appearance of two massive historical figures, Moses and Elijah.
The standard interpretation here is that Moses represents the law and Elijah represents the prophets.
But the source has a specific view on their role in this moment.
It insists they are subordinate witnesses, not equal partners. They appear to show that Jesus is not abolishing God's prior revelation in the Old Testament. He is the culmination and fulfillment of it.
The law and the prophets point to him.
Exactly. But Peter, who is likely still reeling from the rebuke he received 6 days earlier, completely misreads the situation.
Yeah, he speaks up and offers to build 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.
And the source labels this Peter's error of equalization.
You know, I have to defend Peter here, or at least try to understand his psychology.
Fair enough.
Put yourself in his sandals. He's standing on a freezing mountain, and the two greatest figures in Jewish history, men who have been dead for centuries, are suddenly standing right in front of him, bathed in blinding light.
He is terrified.
Yeah. Offering to build tents or tabernacles seems like a natural human instinct to be hospitable, to honor these heroes of the faith, and maybe to prolong the experience so they don't leave.
It's a very pragmatic response.
So why does the author view a simple act of hospitality as such a massive fundamental theological error?
The source views it harshly because treating Christ, Moses, and Elijah as peers, even with good intentions, undermines the entire nature of who Jesus is.
How so?
The author argues it represents humanity's pragmatic instinct to organize, manage, and domesticate divine revelation. Peter wants to build earthly structures, but the Father wants him to listen to the heavenly decree.
Oh,
To honor the Old Testament correctly requires recognizing its complete and total subordination to the Son. The greatest servants of God, the lawgiver and the prophet, cannot be placed on the same level as the Creator.
they are there to testify as servants, but the Son is there to rule as the sovereign.
Precisely.
And we see how seriously God takes that distinction, because Peter's words are suddenly cut off. He doesn't even get to finish his pitch about the tents.
A far more authoritative voice interrupts him.
Yeah, completely shifting the entire scene from a visual spectacle to an audible decree. This brings us to verse 5, which the source identifies as the absolute climax of the entire passage.
The text explicitly notes that this happens while he was still speaking. Peter is silenced by the divine presence.
What exactly happens?
A bright cloud overshadows them, and the Father speaks from the cloud. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him."
And the source details the immense theological weight of these specific Greek words. Let's break those down. First, the bright cloud.
Right. In the Old Testament, the cloud represents the Shekinah glory, the raw, blinding, terrifying holiness of God's presence.
When the cloud descended on the tabernacle, no one could enter.
Exactly. But Matthew specifies that this cloud is bright or luminous. The author argues this signals that under the new covenant, the glory of God is approachable through the person of Christ.
Then the voice says, "This is my beloved Son." The source points out that the word used for beloved, agapetos, has massive historical significance for a Jewish reader.
It does. It links back to the Hebrew word yakid, meaning unique, only, or only begotten.
That's the exact word used in the Greek translation of Genesis 22, right?
Yes. When God tells Abraham to take his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loves, and offer him as a sacrifice.
So the Father is identifying Jesus not as a generic child of God in the way believers are called children of God.
Right, but as his unique, uncreated, eternal son who is headed for the ultimate sacrifice.
And then we reach the phrase the author builds the entire first half of the essays upon.
Yes. The text focuses heavily on the Greek verb eudokesa, translated as I am well pleased or I have taken delight.
And the source explains that the grammar here is absolutely critical. The author identifies this as a timeless aorist tense.
Yes, the timeless aorist.
Wait, pause right there. Timeless aorist sounds like an incantation from a fantasy novel.
It really does.
For those of us who didn't spend 4 years parsing ancient Greek verbs in seminary, what does that actually mean mechanically in the sentence?
It's a great question. In Greek, the aorist tense typically describes an action that occurred in the past, a simple snapshot of an event.
Okay, like a completed action.
Right. But when applied to the nature of God, scholars often recognize a timeless or nomic use of the aorist.
So it's not bound by time.
Exactly. It does not mean the Father suddenly became pleased with Jesus at that exact moment on the mountain, as if Jesus had just done a good job and earned the Father's praise.
Okay.
Instead, it signifies a fixed, eternal, unalterable reality that transcends time. The Father has always been, is right now, and will forever be infinitely well pleased in his Son.
It denotes an intense, active, affectionate exaltation that has no beginning and no end.
That's it exactly.
Thinking about that timeless aorist tense, it's like a fundamental law of physics. Think about gravity.
Gravity is a good comparison.
Yeah, gravity didn't just turn on at a specific moment in time when an apple fell from a tree in front of Isaac Newton. It's the constant, unalterable force holding the entire universe together.
It was there before the apple, it's there now, and it will be there tomorrow.
Right. In the same way, this text is arguing that the Father's eternal pleasure in the Son is the constant spiritual force holding the entire fabric of reality together.
That is precisely the theological point the author is driving home. The Father's delight in the Son is the primary reality of existence. Everything else is secondary.
And the command that follows, listen to him, acts as an absolute, exclusive imperative.
The Father cuts off Peter to assert the exclusive authority of Jesus. Moses and Elijah must vanish. Human philosophies, pragmatic ideas, and earthly structures must be silenced.
The voice of the Son is the final word. Now, this discussion moves us into a heavy theological space regarding the crucifixion. The source claims this Trinitarian delight we just discussed, this timeless pleasure of the Father and the Son, is actually the legal and ontological basis for substitutionary atonement.
Yes, the source connects the glory on the mountain to the blood on the cross in a very specific, rigorous legal framework.
Substitutionary atonement being the doctrine that Jesus died in the place of sinners, taking the punishment they deserved.
Right. The author's argument is that if the Father did not possess infinite, absolute satisfaction in the Son's sacrifice on Calvary would carry no saving value for humanity.
So it requires infinite worth.
Exactly. Because the Son is of the same eternal substance as the Father, and because the Father loves the Son with an infinite passion, the death of the Son on behalf of the elect satisfies the infinite justice of God.
A finite human being could never satisfy an infinite offense against a holy God.
Never. The infinite justice of God is satisfied precisely because of the infinite worth, value, and obedience of the Son.
But the source brings up a staggering paradox here that we really need to wrestle with.
Yes, the paradox on the cross.
Right. It references Christ crying out on the cross in Matthew 27, quoting Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me?
A terrifying moment.
It is. The text states that even while bearing the raw, unmitigated wrath of God against human sin, the Son remained the object of the Father's supreme affection because of his flawless obedience.
And believers are therefore, as the Apostle Paul says, accepted in the Beloved.
But I need some serious clarification on this paradox. How can God simultaneously pour out unmitigated judicial wrath and experience infinite pleasure in the exact same person at the exact same moment? It sounds like a total contradiction.
It is the ultimate paradox of the Christian faith, and the author addresses this by pointing to the voluntary nature of the Son's obedience.
Okay, unpack that.
Referencing John chapter 10, where Jesus says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again." The source argues that the path of suffering was the sovereignly ordained work of the Son.
He wasn't a victim of circumstance.
Exactly. The Father is pouring out judicial wrath upon the sin that Christ is bearing as a substitute. But simultaneously, the Father is infinitely pleased with the Son's perfect, love-driven obedience in bearing that wrath to save his people.
So the Father hates the sin, but perfectly loves the Son who is carrying it.
Yes. The Father's pleasure in the Son is the fountain from which all grace flows. Through this propitiation, this wrath-absorbing sacrifice, the Father's infinite delight in his Son is legally extended and imputed to believers.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time in the ancient world looking at Greek grammar, first-century geography, and high-minded theology about the atonement.
We have covered a lot of ground.
We have. But the source material does not leave it there in the ivory tower. The author takes this ancient exegesis and uses it as a fairly blunt instrument against some very modern cultural, political, and ecclesiastical movements.
Yes, moving into the final section of our analysis, we encounter a highly specific, aggressive application of this text.
Right. And just as a quick caveat for you listening, before we get into this next part, I want to be really clear. Our goal here is to map out the author's argument and show how they bridge Matthew 17 to modern debates.
We are objectively reporting on the connections the author makes.
Right. We are not endorsing either side of these highly charged political and theological issues. We are just outlining the logic of the source material.
Yeah, exactly.
So with that understood, how does the author get from a mountain in the first century to critiques of modern sociopolitical theory?
The author bridges that gap by interpreting the Father's command, listen to him, as an absolute exclusive boundary for truth.
Okay.
The premise is that the written word of Christ, the closed canon of Scripture, is entirely sufficient for all matters of faith, practice, and human flourishing.
Therefore, any framework outside the strict biblical canon that attempts to explain the human condition or dictate moral action is viewed as a competing voice.
That is the author's exact argument. The author explicitly attacks Arminianism, arguing it places the final determination of salvation in human free will, which the author sees as elevating human autonomy over God's sovereign decree.
It also attacks Roman Catholicism, right?
Yes, arguing it adds human works, papal authority, and priestly intercession to Christ's finished sacrifice. But it goes further into the secular realm. It explicitly attacks liberal theology, critical race theory, and Marxist-derived social theories.
Let's look at the mechanics of that argument. How does the author connect Peter wanting to build a tent for Moses to a modern church adopting a sociological framework like critical race theory?
Well, the author argues that Peter's error of equalization, trying to elevate Moses and Elijah to equal status with Jesus, is the exact same error modern churches make when they adopt secular theories to explain systemic issues or human nature.
So it's about adding to the revelation.
Right. Just as Peter tried to add his own pragmatic idea to the divine revelation, the author claims that modern movements try to elevate secular sociological frameworks, human traditions, or philosophical theories to the level of biblical authority.
By shifting focus away from the gospel of justification by faith alone to focus on Marxist-derived theories of class or racial struggle, the author claims these movements are actively defying the Father's command from the cloud to listen only to the Son.
The argument is that these are human traditions attempting to share the mountain peak with Christ.
The text also details some very strict ecclesiastical applications based on this exact same premise of the sufficiency of the Word.
Yes, the source advocates strongly for cessationism.
Which is the position that the miraculous gifts have ceased.
Right. The theological position that the miraculous gifts of the early church, such as modern charismatic prophecies, speaking in tongues, and apostolic healings, have stopped.
What's the logic there based on Matthew 17?
The author's logic is that because the biblical canon is closed and complete, seeking new prophecies is a violation of the command to listen to him, as revealed in Scripture. Seeking new revelation implies the existing revelation is insufficient.
And it also advocates for complementarianism.
It does. It rejects egalitarian models of leadership in the home and church, arguing that the biblical text provides a fixed, authoritative order that cannot be overturned by modern cultural shifts.
And there's one more, right? Dispensationalism.
Yes. Finally, the author argues for dispensationalism, viewing the Transfiguration as a literal, physical foretaste of a future premillennial kingdom where Christ will visibly reign in Jerusalem.
So in all these specific applications, the author's underlying logic remains consistent.
Yes. The written word of Christ is the final sufficient revelation, meant to silence all other voices, theories, and supposed new revelations.
The source paints a very stark, unyielding line, arguing that adopting frameworks outside of the biblical canon, whether they are political, sociological, or charismatic, is an act of spiritual rebellion against the sovereign command given on the mountain.
That is the core of their application.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize the overarching narrative arc we've traced from the valley to the peak.
It's quite a trajectory.
It is. Following the terrifying voice from the bright cloud, the disciples fell on their faces in absolute terror. They were undone by the holiness of God.
But the text says, Jesus came and touched them, telling them to rise and have no fear.
And when they lifted their eyes, Matthew records a beautiful, simple phrase. They saw Jesus only.
Jesus only.
The cloud had lifted, the blinding light had subsided, the voice was quiet, and Moses and Elijah were gone. The entire event, according to the source, is designed to strip away all other authorities, all other comforts, all human traditions, and all earthly expectations until only the Son remains.
The beloved Son is majestic enough to make them fall to the ground in terror. but merciful enough to reach out, touch them, and raise them back up.
That specific phrase, Jesus only, is the core exegetical theology the author wants the reader to walk away with.
Right. The witnesses of the law and the prophets have done their job. The human attempts to manage the glory have been silenced, and the church's gaze is meant to be fixed exclusively on the person and work of Christ.
Well, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your week.
What do you have for them?
We started by contrasting the nervous, sweaty party host with the host who is overflowing with uncontainable joy.
We did.
If the primary reality of the universe is the Father's infinite self-sufficient joy in the Son, if the entire cosmos is basically a grand, expansive theater built specifically to display that relationship, how does that shift the way you view your own daily anxieties?
That's a great question.
How does it reframe your constant need for validation from your boss, your spouse, or your social media feed? How does it change your sense of place in the grand scheme of things?
It changes everything.
If the center of absolute reality is a fundamentally happy God overflowing with joy, rather than a needy cosmic beggar demanding your performance to keep the universe running, how does that alter the way you step into your tomorrow?
It's definitely something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.